Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be talking about something that's really important, especially as you guys are all becoming voters, and that is revolutions. What they are, what causes them, and what they could mean for us and for American democracy.
It's really all about learning from history so we don't repeat the same mistakes,
Oh,
right?
right. Like, we're going to look at what happened in other countries and hopefully learn how to avoid those problems here. So it's kind of like having a crystal ball that can show us the future.
Exactly. And we can see if those same warning signs that led to revolutions in the past are starting to show up here in the US. Kind of like checking a patient's temperature. If it's too high, then you know something's wrong.
So where do we even begin? What are some of the main reasons why revolutions happen? Like what makes people want to overthrow their governments in the first place?
Well, one of the biggest reasons is that people feel like they're being treated unfairly by their leaders, like their voices aren't being heard and they don't have any control over their own lives. It's like in a family when the parents make all the rules without listening to their kids. Eventually, those kids are going to rebel.
That makes sense. So it's not just about being unhappy. It's about feeling like you have no power, like the system is rigged against you.
Exactly. And when the government is ignoring the needs of the people, or even worse, actively oppressing them, that's a recipe for disaster. A classic example is King Charles I of England. He tried to rule like a dictator, dismissing parliament and basically doing whatever he wanted.
And how did that work out for him?
Not so well. It led to a civil war, and ultimately he was executed. Pretty extreme consequence, right?
Yeah, definitely not a good example to follow. But it's not just about dictators, right? What about democracies like ours? Can revolutions happen in a country where people have the right to vote?
They definitely can. Even in a democracy, revolutions can happen if people feel like the system isn't working for them, like they're being ignored or that their vote doesn't really matter. Think about the American Revolution. We revolted against British rule because we didn't have any representation in Parliament. No taxation without representation was the rallying cry back then.
Oh, yeah. We learned about that in school. It was all about having a say in how you're governed.
Right. People want to feel like their voices are heard, that they have a say in their own future, and when they lose faith in the system, that's when things get really dangerous.
So it's like that feeling of helplessness, like you're trapped and there's no way out.
Right. And another big factor is corruption. When people see that their leaders are dishonest, only looking out for themselves or just wasting money, it creates a lot of resentment and anger.
Yeah. I mean, nobody likes to feel like they're being taken advantage of, especially by the people in power.
Absolutely. And a prime example of that is the French Revolution. The French monarchy was incredibly corrupt and out of touch with the common people. They were spending lavishly while the people were struggling to survive.
Oh, yeah. Marie Antoinette and all that. I think we've all heard that story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It created a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and eventually it led to a very bloody revolution.
So it sounds like there are a few key ingredients for a revolution: oppression, lack of representation, and corruption.
You got it. When those things start to build up, it's like pressure building in a volcano, just waiting to erupt. And it doesn't just happen overnight, it's a process. It takes time for those feelings of anger and frustration to reach a boiling point.
So we've got these major causes, but what happens next? Like when those pressures start building, how do governments usually react? Does it make things better or worse?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. And we'll talk more about that after a quick break.
All right, so when governments start feeling that pressure, like they're losing control, their reactions can be pretty different. Sometimes they try to just clamp down, like a parent trying to control a teenager who's getting out of line.
So they just try to shut everything down.
Yeah, kind of. They might censor the media so people can't talk about what's going on, or they crack down on protests and try to silence anyone who's speaking out against them.
That sounds kind of scary. Like they're just trying to make the problem go away by force instead of actually dealing with it.
Exactly. And usually that doesn't end well. Repression might work for a little while, but it just makes people angrier and more determined to fight back. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. Eventually it's going to pop back up.
Okay, so what's the alternative? If clamping down is a bad idea, what should governments do when people are unhappy and demanding change? Well, the smart move is to actually listen to the people and make some real changes. Actually try to fix the problems that are causing all this unrest. It's like realizing you've made a mistake and trying to correct it before things spiral out of control.
So it's all about being flexible and adapting to the situation.
Right. And a really good example of this is something called the Glorious Revolution in England.
Oh, yeah, I think I remember learning a bit about that in history class. Wasn't that a pretty big deal?
It was a huge deal. Basically, the king at the time, King James II, was trying to hold on to all the power, and Parliament basically said enough is enough. They invited William and Mary to come and take over, but only if they agreed to share power with Parliament.
So it was like a compromise. They avoided a full-blown revolution by finding a way to share power.
Exactly. It showed that sometimes leaders can prevent a disaster by being willing to compromise and listen to the people they're supposed to be representing.
Okay, so we've talked about governments cracking down and governments reforming. But what if neither of those things works? What happens if a revolution actually succeeds? Like the government gets overthrown. What happens next?
Well, that's when things get really interesting. The most obvious result is that the old government is gone. But what comes after that? Well, it can be a lot of different things. It's not always a happy ending, unfortunately.
So it's not like just flipping a switch and everything magically gets better.
Nope, not at all. Sometimes a revolution does lead to a more democratic system, like what happened in the American Revolution, but it can also lead to new forms of tyranny, just trading one bad leader for another.
So you're saying revolutions are kind of a gamble. You never really know what you're going to get in the end.
In a way, yeah. Think about the Russian Revolution, for instance. They got rid of the Tsar, but they ended up with a communist dictatorship that was just as brutal, if not more so. And the French Revolution, while it had some good intentions, it led to years of terror and violence.
Wow, so revolutions are really complicated. They can have some really unintended consequences.
They are. It's not a simple solution. They're like a powerful storm. They can bring much needed change, but they can also cause a lot of destruction along the way.
Okay. So we've talked about what causes revolutions, how governments react, and the different ways things can turn out. But here's the big question. Is the U.S. on the verge of a revolution? Are we seeing those same warning signs here that we saw in those other countries before things went bad?
That's a really important question. And to answer it, we need to be honest with ourselves about the problems we're facing. We need to look at the evidence and see if those alarm bells are ringing.
All right, let's get down to it. Are we really at risk of a revolution here in the U.S.? And if so, what are the things we should be worried about?
Well, let's dive into those warning signs and see if we can find some answers.
Okay, so we've talked about how things can go south, and that's definitely a little scary. But earlier you said it's not all doom and gloom, right? History also has some good news for us.
You're right. There are a lot of examples where things looked really bad for a country. I mean, really bad, like headed for disaster, but somehow they managed to pull back from the brink. It's like watching a car skid out of control and almost go over a cliff, but the driver manages to regain control at the very last second.
Okay, phew, that's a relief. So tell me about some of those success stories. What can we learn from countries that were able to turn things around?
Well, one of the most inspiring stories is Germany after World War II. They went from a Nazi dictatorship to a thriving democracy. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of hard work. They had to dismantle the Nazi institutions, teach people about democracy, and rebuild their economy and their whole country, really, with help from other countries.
So it sounds like it was a combination of addressing the root causes of the problem, creating a new foundation for a better future, and getting support from the international community.
Exactly. And then there's South Korea. They were under military rule for decades, but through persistent protests, pressure from the international community, and a commitment to democratic reforms, they transformed into a successful democracy.
It's really encouraging to see that even when things look really, really bad, change is still possible. But it requires a lot of effort and commitment from everyone.
Absolutely. And it's not just about big dramatic events. Sometimes it's about those everyday actions that slowly but surely move a society in the right direction. Take the civil rights movement in the U.S., for example. It was a long and difficult struggle, but through nonviolent protests, legal battles, and a lot of courage, they made incredible progress towards equality.
You're right. It shows that we can all play a part in shaping our future.
Yeah.
But what are some of the key things that make these turnarounds work? What lessons can we apply to the U.S. today?
One of the most important factors is education. Informed citizens who understand their rights and responsibilities are the foundation of any democracy. It's like having a strong immune system that can fight off misinformation and extremism.
Knowledge is power. But it's not just about individual citizens, right? We also need strong institutions to make sure things run smoothly and fairly.
Absolutely. Checks and balances, a fair and independent judiciary, a free press, these are all essential for a healthy democracy. Think of them like the foundation of a house. If they're weak or corrupt, the whole structure becomes unstable.
Makes sense. So education and strong institutions are key, but what about when things get really heated and people disagree strongly? How do we prevent those disagreements from turning into violence and chaos?
That's where dialogue and compromise come in. We have to learn to talk to each other respectfully, even when we disagree. We have to be willing to listen and try to understand different perspectives. Remember, democracy isn't about everyone always agreeing. It's about finding ways to work together, even when we have different opinions.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It's about finding common ground. But how do we do that when things feel so divided?
It's tough, but it's essential. We need to start by recognizing that we all share some common goals. We want a safe and prosperous and just society. We might disagree about how to get there, but if we can focus on those shared goals, it makes it easier to bridge those divides.
It's not about pretending our differences don't exist. It's about finding those areas where we do agree and building on them.
Right. And remember, democracy is always a work in progress. It takes constant work and participation from all of us. It's not something that just happens automatically. The future isn't set in stone. We can shape it through our choices and actions.
That's a really powerful message. So to sum it all up for our listeners, we are at a critical point, but it's not too late to make things better. By learning from history, having thoughtful conversations, and getting involved in our democracy, we can create a better future for ourselves and for our country.
You're not just a spectator. You have a voice, and your actions make a difference. Stay informed, stay involved, and never underestimate your own power to make a positive impact. The future of American democracy is literally in your hands.
That's it for our deep dive today. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll be back soon to explore more big questions that affect our world.